Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Well,
Unusual
thank you,
report.
Frank, and thank you, Victoria, for
Okay.
your invitation to join you at the Jung Center in Buffalo and the Episcopal Church there. It's nice that you have that alliance. Um, I've been blessed by good experiences with Jungian Center in Chicago when I was living there for a number of years. John Giannini, many Jungians know, was on my faculty at ICCS there. And also, I've had some good experience with the Jung Center in San Diego, which like to sponsor good events. And also good experiences in Houston, the Jung Center there, where I did dialogue with Buddhist Lama Somo. And um, and then I have a friend who's a Jungian analyst here in the Bay Area. And so I've been, what should I say, in my own way, a student of Jung along the way, and I admire him. In fact, I thought I'd begin with a couple statements from him about the mystics because we're looking at the mystics together this afternoon in light of our current crises as a species and as a nation. So we have this one sentence from Carl Jung. To the mystics we owe what is best in humanity. To the mystics we owe what is best in humanity. That's a heck of a short sentence. You would think people would be awfully interested in what's best in humanity, seeing as we seem to be going through what's the worst in humanity with every headline, not only about the democracide that is going on, the pushing aside of a notion that that people could have a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, in favor of a government of billionaires, by billionaires, and for billionaires, and don't even have to talk about the bill passed last night. But it's not fully passed. There was still time to fight. But I just think that one statement from Jung is just stunning. That hey, mystics, why don't we know more about the mystics if they represent the best in humanity? Well, maybe that's why. Maybe mainline capitalism is not interested in publishing, if you will, or pursuing what's best in humanity. You'd rather operate at what's worst in humanity. Let's build more greed. Let's build more envy. Let's build more oppression of the poor. And yeah, while we're at it, why don't we give a great big tax break to the billionaires of the world? Elon Musk certainly needs another tax break. And meanwhile, we can kill Medicaid and Medicare and Social Security and anything that's trying to act in a way that it includes compassion, which is Christ-like teaching and a Buddha-like teaching and a Muhammad-like teaching, and it's all around the world, all the major religions criticize greed and propose that, hey, we're capable of compassion. So that's one sentence from Jung that I think deserves our attention as we begin. And another is this sentence: only the mystics bring what is creative to religion itself. Only the mystics bring what is creative to religion itself. You would think that religion, especially in the West today, where churches are closing down so fast they can't even sell them all off fast enough. I mean, I know one Catholic diocese in the East Coast, I won't name it by name, but they spent a whole year or 2 years ago just shutting down churches. That was their main occupation, shutting them down because they can't afford them anymore. They can't afford the heat bills and the electricity bills and the shoveling of the snow bills and everything else. But the point is, well, back in years ago here in San Francisco, I live outside San Francisco, but in the Bay Area. Um, they were shutting down churches under Pope John Paul II, left and right. I think they shut down 13.
Okay,
And someone wrote in the Chronicle, letters to the editor of the San Francisco Chronicle, hey, this is a mismanaged corporation. They're selling off their assets instead of asking, why doesn't anyone want what we have to offer these days? Well, maybe we should listen to Jung on this. Only the mystics bring what is creative to religion itself. And of course, now in our time, there are more people in North America and the United States who identify as none, and that's not N-U-N, but N-O-N-E, than there are people who identify with any particular faith. So people are leaving the churches, and who in the churches, running the churches, are asking what we can do about this. Well, if Jung is right, they ought to be probing the mystics. And because these people who are leaving institutional religion are not leaving spirituality. More and more we hear them say, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. One friend of mine, Brian Swim, cosmologist, I was dining with him a few years ago, and we were talking about our lives, and he's a practicing Catholic with his wife, but and a scientist, cosmologist. But he said he was talking about his sons who were 30 and 31 at the time, and I said to him, Brian, do your sons practice? And he looked up. I remember before we were in a Chinese restaurant, and the fork was halfway to his mouth and just stopped. And he said, Matt, I don't know anyone under 30 who practices who isn't weird. Now, that's a strong statement coming from an intelligent and scientist of our time and a practicing Christian. But that's what he said. This was about, I don't know, it was before COVID. So I guess it was about 6 years ago. Anyone under 70, under 30 who's practicing who isn't weird. Now, you think the churches might be a little interested in an observation like that by a practicing scientist and Catholic. But if you're interested, you ought to go to the mystics if you're going to look at what Jung has to say, because the mystics reinvent religion. That's why so many of them get in trouble. So many of them get in trouble because they're trying to reinvent religion. And one fellow we'll be dealing with today, of course, is John of the Cross. And I just finished my manuscript. Well, I just took it literally this afternoon to the printer to run it off so I can read through it one more time. But I've just done a manuscript on John of the Cross and trying to reinterpret him and retranslate him for our times. But he had an amazing life, and it wasn't easy. And the Inquisition was hounding him 24/7. Then a third statement from Jung, and then we'll move on to the rest, but I just kind of want to put this in a Jungian context, is his emphasis on the age of Pisces ending and the age of Aquarius beginning. And I just think that's very significant that he talks about that, because the early Christians, like most other people, looked at astrology in terms of history. That was their way, one way in which they tried to wrestle with history. And the early Christians knew some astrology. On the earliest catacomb walls, we have pictures of Pisces, of the fishes swimming in opposite directions. So the early Christians did see themselves as Piscean. And they felt that the age of the ram had just ended with Jesus, that the 2,000-year period of the sacrifice of the ram and the lamb ended with the sacrifice of Christ on the cross, and a new age was launching. And then Jesus said things like, I'll make you fishers of men. And of course, baptism is a watery thing, it's fishy thing, and all that. So, and then what characterizes Pisces, I think, is dualism, two fish swimming in the opposite direction. So the last 2,000 years of Christianity, which is the only version of Christianity we have, although it does vary with different cultures, obviously, but under the consciousness of the Piscean era, clearly there was a lot of dualism in Christianity, and especially clear in Augustine and the whole movement to adapt Neoplatonism, which separates spirit from matter. Augustine said, and I quote, "Spirit is whatever is not matter," unquote. You can't get any more dualistic than that. Now, the whole creation tradition tried to fight that dualism. Thomas Aquinas, 13th century, says spirit is elan, the vitality in everything. So he absolutely, and that's why he said, I prefer Aristotle to Plato, because Aristotle does not denigrate matter. So there's a whole movement signified by Aquinas and others who are trying to break that dualism that overpowered really a lot of Christianity. And of course, another notion from Augustine of original sin also set Christianity on a detour. And of course, that occurred at the very same time, the 4th century, when the church inherited the empire that was collapsing all around it. So that's part of the Piscean story vis-a-vis Christianity. But at this moment in history, our generation, whether you're in your 80s like I am, or whether you're 8, we're in a new era. We're not in the Piscean dualistic era anymore. And this new era, Aquarius, is signified by a flood, a flood of the unconscious coming conscious. As Jung said, in the age of Aquarius, evil will no longer be underboard. It'll not be hidden. It'll be on top of the table. We can all see it. Tax breaks to billionaires stolen from Medicare, Medicaid, old folks' homes, rural hospitals, and all the rest. That's evil. And we should see it for what it is. But as Jung also pointed out, will we have the will? It's one thing to see evil. It's another thing to call it evil. It's another thing to do something about it. Will we have the will? Will we have the spirituality? Will we have the courage and the strength, the inner strength, to do something about it? And of course, the other evil of our time is matricide, the killing of Mother Earth. And that is even more pressing in the sense that it's absolutely an ultimate question. We are facing our extinction. Do we have the will? Do we have the spiritual strength, the energy, and the courage to do something about that? Well, again, this is where the mystics come in, because they are specialists. When they talk about the dark night, they are specialists at letting go. And they're telling us that we even have to let go of divinity as we perceive it in order to regain the full vision of being authentically human. Meister Eckhart in the 13th century, late 13th, early 14th, they said, I pray God to rid me of God. I pray God to rid me of God. But that's the ultimate in the apophatic divinity. The apophatic divinity is about divinity that is dark, divinity that is mystery. As Eckhart says, God is super essential darkness who has no name and will never be given a name. It's an honoring of the mystery of divinity. Here in America, we have God's name stamped on every dollar bill and coin, and God we trust, and MX missile and presidential speech. We've lost the sense of the mystery of divinity and that darkness, which is part of the dark night of the soul, which we're getting into now. So, in contrast to the dualism of Piscean age, today we need this flood, this release of mysticism. And what do I mean by mysticism? When in one word, Julian Norwich, one of the first woman to write a book in English, so one of the founders of the English language, talks about oneing, O-N-E-I-N-G. That's one of the many words she invented. She also invented the word enjoy. So her definition of mysticism is oneing. It is a union of the human and the divine. She says between God and the human, there is no between. Well, that's what all the mystics are talking about, that there is a union between us and the human. Meister Eckhart invented a word for mysticism. He was one of the inventors of the German language, and he invented a word, Durchbruch. We translate quite literally, breakthrough, breakthrough. That's his word for mysticism, the mystical experience. He says in breakthrough, I learned that God and I are one. Well, it's the same thing that Julian means by oneing, isn't it? You see, our deepest experiences need poets or other artists to name, because they go beyond the rational brains and rational concepts. That's the experience of the intuitive brain, what Einstein called the intuitive brain as distinct from the rational brain. And he says it's from the intuitive brain that we get our values, not from the rational brain. But we live in a society that honors the rational brain and has forgotten the intuitive brain. That's what Einstein said. And he said, and I quote, well, he said that is why he, quote, abhors American education, unquote. Because it's all about the rational and has no room for the intuitive, what I'm calling the mystical. Now, my one word, well, I have two one word understandings of mysticism. One is ecstasy. And in that, I'm on board with Thomas Aquinas, because that's his one word definition of mysticism, ecstasy. Ecstasis, stand outside of yourself. That is, outside of the small self, the ego self, and thereby in tune with the big self, with the cosmic self, with the cosmic Christ, or the whole of our being. But another one-word definition I use is simply lover. The mystic in every one of us is a lover in us. And you can match that with those other words. Wanting, there's wanting in loving. There's breakthrough in loving. There's ecstasy in loving. And in fact, Aquinas time and again returns to the Song of Songs, a beautiful book in the Hebrew Bible about lovemaking as a theophany, as an experience of the divine. Now, many Christian theologians over the centuries have tried to clean that book up and say, oh, it's not about what they're telling us. It's not about love and sexual love. It's about God loving the church, or God loving Jesus, or God loving your soul. But ask any Jew, it's their book. And part of their practice on the Sabbath is this. They're supposed to read the Song of Songs and then make love. So there's no secret in the Jewish tradition about what it's about. But the Jewish tradition did not succumb to the dualism of Neoplatonism, and of course Augustine, etc., with the notions, conscious or unconscious, that sexuality is a problem instead of a gift. I'll turn this thing off, sorry. Okay, now, how do we weather the bad news these days? There's bad news every day, and it can be overpowering. And whether it's about matricide, the killing of Mother Earth, the raising of the seas, the increased hurricanes, everything that's happening with Mother Nature, Mother Earth, or whether it's about the collapse of democracy and so forth, the rise of fascism, the rise of authoritarianism, the out of control reptilian brain that marks pseudo-masculinity, inauthentic masculinity, and has many, many young men in our cultures today very confused. All these issues complement one another. It's all part of a bigger problem. And we hear newscasters say, we've been hearing it for years, oh, this is unprecedented. Oh, this is unprecedented. Oh, this is unprecedented. Or in another language, they say, we don't have words for this. We don't have words for this. We don't have words for this. Well, we do have words for it. The word is evil. And we have archetypes for it. But we're afraid to talk about evil in our culture. Churches are afraid to talk about evil. They're so busy talking about sin, they have forgotten what evil is. Evil is so much deeper than sin. Evil brings in negative spirits. And I learned this from a friend of mine and a co-teacher, Buck Ghosthorse, a Lakota teacher, who worked in my faculty for 3 years and then went on to start his own community of sun dancers and so forth in the state of Washington. But one day he said to me, you know, in our tradition, fear is a door in the heart that lets evil spirits in. And that's just a tremendous teaching about evil. Fear is a door in the heart that lets evil spirits in. Well, I believe we have a door in each of our chakras. Yes, the heart is the central chakra. But I think we have a door in our throat chakra that lets evil spirits in. And the door in our mind chakra and our top chakra and our gut chakra, our sexual chakra, and our first chakra. And evil spirits come in if we don't guard that door. And then Buck went on to say, real prayer is strengthening your heart so that evil stays on the outside with its spirits. Because if you look at the history of humanity and the history of this country, evil has always been part of it. Evil doesn't go away. As Martin Buber said, you don't stomp out evil. It's spiritual. It lives far beyond us. It invades our biggest institution because it goes where the power is, whether we're talking Supreme Courts or religious headquarters or Wall Street or anything, economic headquarters, military headquarters, religious headquarters, Supreme Court headquarters. That's where you'll find the spirits working. And I think we've seen it, plenty of it in our lifetime. And our ancestors have seen it. So there's that inner strength again that that Buckhoster is alluding to. And also that he used the word door so interesting to me as a Christian, that I am the door idea from the Christ is very powerful. And it takes on a whole new meaning and richness when Buck says that fear is the door in the heart, the door in the heart that lets evil spirits in. And I'm saying, yes, and the door in the other chakras too. But again, he's allowing the language about evil spirits to come back. The churches are afraid to use these languages. I wrote a book, 15 years ago with scientist Rupert Sheldrake on angels. And he's the only scientist in the world, I think, with the balls to write a book about angels with a theologian. And I'm one of the few theologians of my generation who's dared write a book on angels, much less with a scientist. But that there are spirits, and that we encounter them. We encounter them in sweat. I've encountered a lot of them in sweat lodges. We encounter them in prayer. I've encountered them in our cosmic masses for sure. But they're also negative spirits, and we need language to encounter that. So my recent book on Trump and the MAGA movement as Antichrist, I've tried to bring back an archetype that has been kind of owned by the right wing in Christianity for centuries. I don't think I've ever talked about the Antichrist before I wrote this book about it, but here's what happened. It was an experience I had last summer. In June, I was teaching a week-long course in Orvieto, Italy. And a friend of mine who helped organize the course, who's an Italian theologian, took me to the cathedral there, which is a beautiful cathedral. Some people call it the most beautiful cathedral in Europe. I certainly would call it the most beautiful cathedral in Italy, the Orvieto Cathedral. But he took me to it, didn't say a word, and put me into a big chapel where there was a huge fresco, and just put me in front of it, and I stared at it. And I said out loud, my first words were, "It feels like Donald Trump." And then I went up to the title, and it said, Antichrist, Deeds and Preacher. And we can show that picture right now. And I've counted, I think, is it 172? No, that's the number 2. You're on number 3 there. There you go. Thank you. I think there it is. I think I counted 172 characters in it. And there's a lot going on. We don't have a lot of time to go into a lot of it. But in the left-hand corner, Satan is being thrown out of heaven by God there. So that's evil coming to earth. And then notice the fellows in black. back there. They have been called the Ku Klux Klan in black, but I think they look to me like Musk's people who are invading Social Security office and everything, stealing our names and Social Security numbers. But you see, that's a good thing about art. You see, it has many interpretations, and good art brings you from different periods to today. This painting was done in 1501, early 16th century, by Luca Signorelli. And just very quickly, I want to say that Freud was in love with this painting. He went to this cathedral 3 different occasions to spend time there to study it. So this painting has had a tremendous impact. A whole book has been written about that, Freud et Orvieto, and my whole first chapter of my book is on that reality. But look down in the center. Oh dear, we're jumping around now. There. Okay, so you see there in the center, there's a preacher in red on top of a pedestal. That's the Antichrist. And the devil is whispering in his ear. And of course, he's pointing at himself because narcissism is an integral part of the archetype of the Antichrist. And there's the close-up of that picture. And notice they share the same left arm. The Antichrist and Satan are sharing the same left arm. So there's a lot going on in this picture. And there are famous people in it. On the right is Christopher Columbus. And this was painted in 1501. Well, he only left for the New World. Well, he thought he was going to India and got lost, but he left in 1492, right? So this painting is done of him less than 10 years after his experience that made him so famous. So there's a lot going on in this picture, but notice that it is talking about the Antichrist. Today in America, you can't use that language, even in churches. I don't know a single religious journal that had the courage to review my book when I wrote on the Antichrist and Trump. I guess maybe they were afraid that they would be investigated by the IRS or something. But it's just so interesting to me that religion wants to talk all the time about sin and can't talk about evil, even though we have it in our tradition. That's what an archetype is. It's a universal image that catches people's imagination in a big way and names something profoundly real and profoundly important, like evil. Now let's go back to Hildegard of Bingen in the next picture. She, of course, was a 12th century abbess and artist and musical genius. And she painted this picture called Powers, Principalities, and Antichrist. So, and by the way, the previous painting was beginning of 16th century. Well, shortly after that painting was done, Martin Luther was talking about the Pope as Antichrist, because he was talking about the evil going on in Rome at that time, and there was plenty of it. And then the other reformers, Calvin, John Knox, they were reluctant, but eventually they started talking about Antichrist too. So I just bring that in as part of the historical evidence that Christianity has a language for talking about evil and has not always been afraid to use it. Now here up in the left-hand corner, very quickly, I'll do a quickie thing on this, but you have 5 wild animals. Hildegard identifies each one, but one represents greed, one represents warlikeness, one represents envy. But notice they all have this rope in their mouth. What are they doing? They're unfurling order. They're destroying order. The ropes are what keep the order of society together, such as justice. Well, they're the opposite of that. Greed, such as happening literally today, giving billionaires $1 trillion of tax breaks, that will undo the orders of community, the order of society. So then in the upper right-hand corner, you see the Christ. He actually has a peace sign, but what that really means to the painter in the 12th century was it represents 2 prophets, Enoch and Elijah. And then in the bottom picture, it's really strong. On the left, you have Mother Church. And of course, Mother Church in Hildegard's day, 12th century, was kind of like the Supreme Court and agriculture and Wall Street all rolled up in one. I mean, the Mother Church ran things in the 12th century. And she was part of the structure of it, being an abbess. Abbeys were very powerful places. Education happened there, so the whole academic system was involved, etc. But what she paints is Mother Church with red. She says the red on her thighs is blood because the Antichrist, which is pictured between her legs, it has taken over the church, she says, or at least is trying to. And if you look carefully, there's a phallus there as well. So I think she's saying, at least unconsciously, that patriarchy is at the heart of the Antichrist. But then the other picture looks like a B-1 bomber, stealth bomber. It's the same image, but it's now flying. It's got red eyes, and she says the teeth are metal, and it's fierce, and she says that object is dung, marred. You know what that means? That's what's flying out, and it stinks. It's smelling everything up. That's why the people being affected by it, and for her, the church is people, they're holding their noses. It's smelling up the whole culture. So this is a powerful painting of Antichrist. And again, I repeat, previous generations were not afraid to talk about it in Western religion. Now, the next image is also from Hildegard, and that names the opposite of Antichrist, which is the Christ. So obviously, you have to have an archetype of the Christ before you can have an Antichrist. So this Christ is the man in sapphire blue, that's what she calls it, the healing Christ who's inside all of us, inside all people, is this capacity for compassion. That's why his hands are like this, because if you put your hands to your side and bring them up like that, that is the delivering of compassion from heart to hands. It's doing something with your love, with your heart, to help heal. And the golden ropes, those are, she says, the works of God the Creator, holding creation together with justice and love. And the outer white, she says, is the Holy Spirit, inspiring us and the rest of creation to carry on. So those are a few pictures of the Antichrist archetype. But now I want to turn to the archetype of the Dark Knight. And this is where John the Cross comes in. He kind of gets credit for this archetype because he wrote a powerful poem, a beautiful poem, on the Dark Knight. But to understand John the Cross, we have to go a little bit. Can we remove the pictures now? We have to go a little bit into his story. And I'll do a quickie version of his story. He's from Spain, and his mother was a very, very poor woman. She was part Moorish. And his father was a wealthy, aristocratic Spaniard, a business person for his family's sake, and he traveled a lot. And he met his mother in a small town. His mother was a seamstress, and they fell in love in a big way. Well, his family disowned him entirely. This rich family would have nothing more to do with him because he was in love with this poor Moorish woman. So he quit his family and moved in with his wife, partner, but then wife, and they had 3 children. First died at 5, and then the one was mentally retarded, and then John was physically retarded. He had rickets because he was so poor, because his father died when he was 3 years old. So here's his single mother with the only skill she had was sewing. And she went to her in-laws when her husband died and said, please help us. I've got these children, 3 children. They wouldn't give her a penny, not a penny. Not very nice people. And so she raised the 3 kids as best she could on her tiny, tiny salary. But obviously she's a very strong woman. And I say her husband died when John was 3, his father died, and her oldest son died at 5. And then her other son was retarded, if that's the right word, handicapped. And then there was John, who was physically deformed. He never was over 5 feet tall. He never grew up physically very well at all. Okay, then John worked, he got some work in a place for dying people. It's kind of like a hospice, I guess, in our language. But he worked there as a teenager. And then the priest in charge of the hospice, or whatever it was, saw his potential and said, you should get educated and become a priest or something. And he attended a Jesuit high school, so he got a free education. But he didn't choose to become a Jesuit, he chose to become a Carmelite. Now, the Jesuits were new at that time, and they were very adventurous, and they were going all around the world and all this stuff because it was the 16th century. And of course, the Reformation was blazing in every other country in Europe, but the Inquisition was so strong in Spain that it wasn't getting a lot of foothold, but the Inquisition was looking everywhere for heretics to burn. They had already burned a lot of Jews, forced them out of the country or forced them to convert, and the same with Muslims. Spain for centuries was a marvelous gathering of the 3 religions working together. And it was ahead in terms of science and everything else for that very reason, because the Muslim tradition was so much more advanced than the European tradition. But at this time, of course, things were going badly for the non-Christians. And so anyway, John joins the Carmelites. And it turns out that there's a movement going on with Teresa of Avila, who's 20 years older than John, about reforming the Carmelites, the women. Because she was a woman, she's trying to reform the women order, the women nuns. And the point was to make them truer to their original spirit of the order, which was simplicity and contemplation and service. But the wealth and success of the order in Spain, which was now getting lots of wealth, stealing it, of course, from the Americas, the gold and the silver and all the rest, and slaves, the wealth was such that it was very attractive to people in power, such as clergy and religious orders, to do well. So to take on the wealthy, they called them the Celts, the shoed, those were shoes, the shoed Carmelites, and suggest we should be wearing just sandals and be unshoed, discalced Carmelites. That was a whole big deal, a political deal. Now, Teresa was doing it as a woman, but she latched on to John and said, hey, you want to do this as a man? You want to reform the men? And he said, yeah. So he did it, but make a long story short, he was kidnapped and put in one of their monasteries and tortured daily. For over 270 days, he was in solitary confinement in this tiny little room, barely given any food at all. He lost all kinds of weight, with lice, no baths or anything like that, and beaten twice a week by his brothers. Well, he was this close to death, and he knew it, when he got the inspiration to escape. And he escaped on a dark night. And it succeeded against all odds. If you look at the whole physical situation, he not only had the problem of having to get away, because all these men were around, they were sleeping on the ground, on the floor and everything like that, but they had that kind of luck, and the luck of a dark night, the moon wasn't bright, and he had to lower himself out of a second-story window, and when he got outdoors, he had to climb 2 other walls to get away from this monastery in Toledo. You can see the picture of the place. 2 walls he had to get over. I mean, it was a hell of an achievement, and darn lucky. And now, when he was captured for that 9 months in the heat of Spain summer and everything, with no relief, he wrote a poem, his first poem. and he based it on the Song of Songs poem. It's all about love. There's not an ounce of pain in it except for longing. It begins with his longing for his beloved. Now, his beloved is God, but beloved can be anyone's lover. So that's what the whole poem is about. It's very beautiful, and it's long. It's 40 stanzas, 40 stanzas. But he memorized it because he didn't have paper and pencil at first. Just toward the end of his stay, did one jailer give him paper and pencil. So he had memorized it, but he wrote most of it down. But so his first poem was a love poem. And then after he escaped, he ended up first when he finally got over the walls, he ended up in a tavern, and then he went to the nuns, and they took him in. And one nun, we have a description. She said he was nothing but bones. He was a skeleton at my door, she said. I mean, this guy was that close to death. But they, revived him. And then he joined, of course, Teresa's group and other nuns and got his weight back and health back and all that. It's a tremendously political story. Well, folks, this is the via transformativa. What I'm doing in my book is showing that the three paths of purgation, illumination, and union that John uses and that have been used for centuries in Western Christianity do not fit the mystical journey. If you look at John's life, the via transformativa is where everything blew wide open. It's because he was fighting for justice and for an authentic version of religion that he got locked up, that he got tortured, that he came this close to death. Now, he wrote his Dark Night poem after he escaped. And it's a short poem. It's only 8 stanzas, not 40, but 8. And again, it's all about love. And it ends with lovers in bed together, him and his beloved. So if you're looking for the Dark Night, it's not in this Dark Night poem. It's in his commentary, though. He wrote a whole book about it that is very elaborate in his Dark Night stuff. But I just want to point that out to you, that his poetry, which is first class, and as every Spanish poet will tell you, is one of the greatest his poetry is one of the greatest poetry ever in the Spanish language. And of course, the Spanish language is very prone to poetry. It's very musical and full of vowels that rhyme beautifully, etc. But his commentaries tend to be very rational and theological. And they bring in the ascetic and the conceptual in a way that takes you, I think, far from the juice of the mystical poetry. But what I'm saying is that he takes apart in his commentaries, what the Dark Night is like and how awful it can be. And he's naming this archetype. He talks about the dungeon. And of course, he lived in a dungeon. But he talks about how we can be in a dungeon too. So being an archetype, the Dark Night, the dungeon, can apply to any of us, can't it? And what I think I prove in my book is that his writing is prison literature. So many prisoners through the centuries have written great thoughts from prison, whether you're talking about St. Paul or you're talking about Martin Luther King Jr., or Eldridge Cleaver, or Daniel Berrigan, who actually wrote a book called The Dark Night of Resistance. So he kind of applied John the Cross to his being in jail and running from the FBI in the late 60s because he was protesting the Vietnam War, etc. But there's a whole field of prison literature, and that's how I think you have to understand John the Cross's great poetry. The Canticle, literally written in prison. Now, he added a little to it when he got well again, but the poem is 95% written in prison. And then the Dark Night is written as a telling of the escape from prison. So this is prison literature. And of course, there's plenty of Dark Night in prison. All kinds of people do undergo conversions there because they hit rock bottom. It's not unlike AA and Al-Anon and all these groups too. They are dealing with the dark night. The dark night of alcoholism, the dark night of drugs, the dark night of addiction. These are prisons. It's like being in dungeon. And so all this swells up when we're talking about the dark night. And here's a few things he says about it, because we're in it. That's what I'm saying. We today, 2025, we're in a dark night. So many people are in despair. We don't know what's next. We don't know what's coming. Every day there's new bad news. And we have to take care of ourselves. And that's one of the lessons. And I write about that in my Antichrist book. And the title of the last chapter is Be Like Camels. What does that mean, to be like a camel? A camel has this big hump, right? And before it goes across the desert, which is the dark night, the via negativa, it fills itself up at the watering hole with water. Otherwise, it wouldn't make it. And it does it in a group. Caravans of camels go. It's not a lone thing. The dark night is not for lone rangers. You want to find your allies. That's another rule that comes out of these teachings. Find your allies. And together go to the watering hole. Fill up on biophilia, the love of life. Erich Fromm says, necrophilia grows when biophilia is stunted. How stunted is biophilia in our time, our love of life? How much of life is distractions? The latest gadget, the latest gadget, the latest gadget. Is that what life is about? Gadgets? Isn't there more to it than that? Well, we have to find out. That's what filling up on the via positiva is about. What are the real joys of life, the real beauty in life, the real ecstasies in life? That's one of the ways that you navigate the via negativa. You have to be a camel. And you cannot be in denial about the darkness, about the desert, about the moral void and corruption that is going on daily and in our name and being paid for by our taxes. That's not a solution. Hafiz, the great Sufi mystic of the late 13th century, same era as Meister Eckhart, says, sometimes God wants to do us a great favor, turn us upside down and shake all the nonsense out. That's the dark night of the soul, folks. That's when not only as individuals, but as a people. And I say as a species, because our species is facing our own extinction at this time. We are being turned upside down to shake all the nonsense out. So that's why the dark night is a good thing. And John the Cross says there's a need to break away from certain methods of beginners. They resemble children who kick and cry and struggle to walk by themselves away when their mothers want to carry them. But they make no headway, or if they do, it's at a child's pace. In other words, we have to grow up. We have to leave our mother's suckling and learn to stand. We have to move beyond our adolescence and become adults. And what does it mean to be adult spiritually? Well, it means you live in a world of interconnectivity, the web of creation. That's what Hildegard called it. Another word for it is compassion. Compassion is the response to interconnectivity, interdependence. And now physics and science are on board that the ruling habit of the universe is interdependence. Well, that's what the mystics are saying. The ruling habit of the universe is compassion. And it's the same thing. Meister Eckhart says, what happens to another, whether it be a joy or a sorrow, happens to me. We share the joy, that's the via positiva, the celebration. That's the well, the watering hole, the oasis, and we share the suffering. It's not the dark night is not a private journey. We're in this suffering together. And there's strength in that. That's what groups like AA demonstrate, don't they? And people working for a just cause. That kind of circle is where you get your strength and your energy. A circle of grace. And it's not based on ego and success. I'm thinking AA now is based on bottoming out. It's based on tasting the ashes. It's based on crashing. And all of us are crashing today. Our democracies are crashing. Mother Earth is crashing. And our species that's brought about this crashing of Mother Earth, we're crashing. So there's so much possibility today. It's an invitation. The dark night today, the dark night of soul, of society. And by the way, that phrase was from Rabbi Heschel. He said we shouldn't talk just about the dark night of the soul, but the dark night of society. And Heschel, of course, was an expert at the prophets, and himself, he wrote a major scholarly work on the prophets, but he also acted like one. He joined Martin Luther King's civil rights movement in a big way in the 50s and 60s. And then the third dark night today is this dark night of our species as we face the demise of Mother Earth. All those dark nights have to be seen for what they are. They have to be put on the table like Jung promised would happen in the age of Aquarius. We wouldn't hide them, but put them on the table so we can debate them. And we can learn from our ancestors who have wisdom to teach about how to navigate the dark night. John the Cross calls it a purification of the soul and a time when we learn to be contemplative, to be still, to be quiet, which is, in my language, to tame the reptilian brain, because the reptilian brain is not good at bonding, but it's great at solitude. Crocodiles, snakes, love to lie alone in the sun. They're good at solitude. They have a monk inside of them. We all have a monk inside of us. We all have a capacity for solitude. And that's how you tame the reptilian brain. By meditation and contemplation, by honoring that place of solitude in yourself. So that's a big part, especially in John's description of the dark night. He says the dark night leads you from just meditation, which is about thinking about good things, to contemplation, which is about erasing your memory and just being present to the presence, present to the presence, to the presence of silence, being receptive. It's about engaging the feminine brain more, about taming the testosterone brain, which wants to be active all the time and win, lose, like crocodiles do, and yielding to the mammal brain, which is the brain of compassion and family and kinship, but it's also the brain of contemplation, of stillness. Be still and learn that I am God, as the psalmist puts it. So to dance this dance today of the traumas that are hitting us. And remember, John the Cross, I think it can really be said, was a victim of trauma. What he went through for 270 days was traumatic. And he shows some of the signs of a person who's been through trauma. But also his healing was telling the story. And he didn't tell the story by blaming anybody. If you read his poetry, especially his Dark Night of the Soul poetry, it's about this longing for the divine. It's about longing for love and presence. And so that shows the greatness of the man. And of course, his escape shows the courage of the man. There's this tremendous line in his escape poem, the Dark Night poem, where he says he had no light, no guide, nothing but the fire inside to lead him in this escape, you see. No light, no guide, but the fire inside. And then he goes on and on to describe that fire, the fire of love. And his third great poem is in fact called The Flame, the Living Flame of Love. So for him, fire is a tremendous archetype of the Holy Spirit, of love, of courage, and of the sacred masculine at its best. It's the yang, fire is yang, of course, and yin is the feminine. And there's plenty of that in his poetry as well. And he brings them together. His poems bring together the masculine and feminine. I'm going to share with you the closing of his canticle poem. Now, I told you it's 40 stanzas, so not the whole thing, but just the last few stanzas. This was his very first poem, written in prison, most of it. And it is about this longing for his lover who's lost, and he's longing, he's looking all over. It's a very much a parallel of the Song of Songs poem in the Bible. But in John's day, it was forbidden for a theologian to write or teach about the Song of Songs. And one of his theology professors in his seminary was put in jail for 5 years for daring to talk about the Song of Songs. And this shows how political John was. Remember that John was poor his whole childhood, and there was racism involved too in his poverty, because he was a person of color. His mother was Moorish. And so he knew poverty in the literal sense too. But and this was probably part of his being hated by elements of his community as well, who enjoyed beating him up in a sadistic way on a regular basis. But here's how that canticle ends. My love, let us rejoice. Let your beauty reflect us both. Up the mountain, up the hill where flows the waters, pure and moist, and into the forest, deeper still. Notice the waters, the yin. Push on further amidst the caves and rocky caverns, where we shall fashion our secret tavern, alone in a home of nature's granite, sipping the nectar of pomegranate. Of course, a pomegranate is a very central fruit, and it's very much a symbol of the feminine sexuality. Once there, to me, you'll show what my soul has yearned to know, and then you will bestow yourself, my life, the gift you granted when I became your wife. Now, the soul is feminine in Latin, and so he's talking about his soul as a wife. The breathing of the air, the nightingale singing so fair, the meadows and the splendor there, the serenity of the night, the flames that burn but do not bite. And now here's his last stanza, and I just love it. It gives me goosebumps. All are banished. Even evil Aminadab has vanished. Aminadab, to John, is the devil. It's another name for Satan or Lucifer, Beelzebub. Although in the Bible, Aminadab has a positive reputation as an ancient ancestor of Jesus, but that's not how John's using it, because in the Middle Ages, they turned Aminadab into Satan. Even evil Aminadab has vanished. Now the siege is ending. Peace is pending. The cavalry, sighting waters, is descending. Cavalry, masculine energy, sighting waters, descending to the water, to the river, to the yin. Nothing further needs defending. I just love, now that's my translation, but I have goosebumps. I just love how that poem ends. It's because it's a big adventure. The whole thing's an adventure. But then it ends, and he brings evil in, that the whole thing has been a big deal. You see, this is what Barkostas was talking about. The evil spirits, they're around. We're fighting them. And this is what Paul said too, didn't he? He said, our battle is against the powers and principalities. Powers and principalities are angels. They're genuses, not geniuses, but genuses, species of angels, powers and principalities. So that's the point. As I said earlier, you don't wipe out evil because spirits are immortal. They keep coming back. Racism was what it was in the 60s, and we passed the civil rights bills, etc., thanks to all the protests, people filling the jails, and some people dying, including King. And now, of course, it's unraveling, being consciously unraveled, and here we are. So every generation has to wrestle with the evil. And as what I say, you don't have to use words like Satan and Beelzebub or even Abinadab. Racism is a name for Satan. And sexism is a race for Satan. And patriarchy is a name for Satan. And unbridled capitalism and greed is a name for Satan. So, well, I wasn't able to get into Hildegard and Mector. Well, I got into some of Hildegard. But Hildegard teaches, she writes to her sisters in her community about being strong and being more manly. And she recognizes the connection between virtue and virility, because they both come from the name for man, vir in Latin. Virtue and virility. A virtuous person is a virile person. That's where healthy masculinity, whether you're a woman or a man, comes from. And you who are Jungians with the animus and the anima, you're perfectly home with that marriage, which you find in all of these poets, are these mystics. You find the marriage of the sacred feminine and the divine masculine. You had it right there on the end of that poem, with the waters, that the cavalry was descending, and peace was pending, and nothing more needed defending. So that's part of the gift to our time of the mystics too, is talking about sexuality and gender in a far more broad and wide circumference. And therefore, it does not exclude sexual minorities, whether homosexual or transsexual and so forth. It honors the diversity and the fact that all of us, whether we're straight or gay or bi or anything else, contain these energies of the masculine and the feminine. And all of them need nurturing. They don't just happen. And they need modeling. And they certainly need support and not abuse from our institutions, including so-called religious ones. So let me just close with sharing a few stanzas from the Dark Night poem. I won't do the whole thing, there are 8, but one thing that's interesting, really interesting, is that John's book, he wrote a book commenting on this poem, but it stops after the 3rd stanza. It stops before it's 50% over. I think it's really interesting. And I think what it is John's left brain got so busy commenting on this and trying to interpret it that he kind of crashed, and he couldn't do it anymore. His right brain was wounded by what he was doing to his own poem. That's why I think the 4 paths of crazy spirituality give us a whole new interpretation of John's writing and his life. As I said, the via transformativa is so central to his life, the dungeon experience. But he didn't just write about the Dark Night. He wrote about the via positiva, about all these love affairs he was having, both in the Song of Song, his canticle, and in the Dark Night, and then in his poetry on the flame, the living flame of love. And of course, the via creativa is there because he's a poet. And he's also a writer, a prose writer, but his poetry is what catches everybody. It's pure song. And so all 4 paths are there. He's not just about the Dark Night. He's about, but no one could articulate, he didn't have the 4 paths back then. That happened in the late 20th century that we came up with the 4 paths. But here's how the poem begins. On a dark night, my heart on fire with yearning. Notice the yearning is one of the first words in his canticle too. So yearning, and you know something? Someone has said the difference between religion and spirituality is yearning. The difference between religion and spirituality is yearning. Now, healthy religion, if religion is healthy, there should be no difference between religion and spirituality. But we're living in a time when there is a difference. And it's so interesting that John's poetry always begins with yearning. I took my flight unseen, and turning from the house fast asleep, such gratuitous delight, my soul equally deep in trust and stark repose. So he had to trust, of course. Imagine what adrenaline was going on in him, because if they had caught him, they would have killed him. I mean, he was this close to death anyway. But he did this daring thing. The place was filled with his Carmelite brothers, over 40, that had been beating him and everything. But he found that unfortunately they were sleeping. The darkness itself secured my safety as I, disguised, descended a secret ladder. Such gratuitous delight. He repeats that phrase, gratuitous delight. And his ladder was he wrapped together some cloth and clothes that he found to create a ladder. In night's darkness and in secret, the house fast asleep, my soul equally deep in trust and stark repose. So he repeats those two phrases so you can see how important they are to him. Oh, that blessed night in secret, and no one could observe me. I could see nothing, no light, no day, no lead to mark my way, save for the fire, the flame inside, enlightening my heart, my only guide. O night, you were my guide. O night, more welcoming than the dawn. O night, you bound lover to lover. Thanks to you, the lover and the beloved found each other, transfigured one another, and melted one into the other. So he's praising night. He's singing a song of praise to night because it saved his life. So this is important, that the dark night is here for a reason. We have to reinvent democracy. We have to reinvent the way we're relating to Mother Earth. And that's why we're in a night. But it doesn't have to end badly, and it certainly is not here to freeze us or sink us into despair. It is to shake us up and to find our allies, to make community and resist and fight back with joy as part of the struggle. Okay, so let me be quiet now, and that's a little walk through the dark night of our time.
Thank you, Dr. Fox. That's fantastic. I think I'll switch now to a group view, and if people want to go to their, it's down there at the bottom. It's reactions, and under reactions, you can find a raise hand, and if you would like to raise your hand. If you want to make comments, please keep them short. But if you have questions, that would be great. And I'll see if I see any hands up there. You know, just for myself, you know, in this dissent and in this feeling angry and the disbelief of what's taking place. You know, what you're talking about is reminding me of, you know, through suffering we find wisdom. There's no wisdom without suffering, and so, you know, in this dark night, looking for the wisdom to stay to stay buoyant on the waves of tumult, chaos.
Indeed. Indeed.
So I don't see any hands up.
Damien has a hand up.
Oh, Damien, please unmute and give us what you'd like to share.
Oh, okay. Hi, Matthew. Thank you
Hi,
for
Damien.
that beautiful presentation. Your followers, like myself, on daily meditations, you informed us that you were working on this book, and I'm glad it's coming to a completion. I look forward to reading it. But the summary of today was beautiful and deep, with deep wisdom and comprehension of our times, and how St. John of the Cross and the mystics can help us understand what we're going through, like you say. I was just curious, you just made a brief comment at the end there that at the end of the 20th century, it's like part of the creation spirituality tradition was completed in a way. I don't know what word you use, but I don't know if a fourth element came in at the end of the 20th century. And I was wondering more specifically what that was. If you could verbalize what completed that creation spirituality at the end of 20th century, because I hadn't heard that before.
No, what I was referring to, and I was talking kind of fast, I think, was the four paths that they were named in my original blessing book. And before that, in an article I did on Meister Eckhart. So they came through Meister Eckhart to me. And of course, I spelled them out in some detail in the original blessing book. But that came out in 1983, original blessing book. So that's the end of the 20th century, near the end of the 20th century. But until then, people were running on purgation, illumination, union. And if you look at John's writing, he's all about purgation. I mean, he really lays it on you. And a lot of people cannot read his commentary because it is so heavy around purgation. And he eventually gets to illumination and then to union. But they're like, purgation is 90% of his writing, and those are 10%. But what I'm saying is his life and his other writings, all four paths are there. I mean, like I say, the Via Transformativa is absolutely the center of his life. I mean, his being tortured and all that, out of that came his poetry and his awareness in the depth of his being able to talk about suffering and about the dark night, you see. So the three paths by which he interprets his own poetry is inadequate for his poetry. The four paths are adequate because you find all four paths there, and you find it in his life and his choices. And so it just shows how Christian mysticism has been limping. It's been on crutches because of those three paths, which are not biblical, because they're not Jewish. And one of the most important moments in my life, really, was when I lectured years ago. I was still living in the Chicago area, so it would have been close to 40 years ago, but I lectured at Lutheran School of Theology in Berkeley, and well, actually, it was another town near Berkeley, but I lectured on the four paths. And afterwards, a Jewish visitor came up to me. He said, "I am a student of Sholem. I live in Switzerland, and Sholem is a great student of Jewish mysticism, great scholar of Jewish mysticism." And he said, "But you just talked about those four paths," he said, "those are Jewish." He said, "You're the first Christian theologian I've ever met who threw out the three paths, and those paths are not Jewish." No, I know where they come from, Plotinus and Proclus, who were 3rd and 5th century Neoplatonic philosophers who never read the Bible in their life. I mean, they weren't exposed to it. Nothing wrong with them. But the point is, it's not Jewish. It's based on dualism, and also on rich people. You know, if like they came to Rome and saw the corruption, and they were rich boys, and then they said, "Oh, we got to go through purging to understand the bigger lessons of life." You see. But the Jewish tradition has always been close to the poor, and the prophets, of course, reminded them when they weren't. So, and of course, Jesus was Jewish and prophetic. So the four paths are Jewish and therefore biblical, and the three paths are not. But that's all John had to work with his poetry and with even looking at his life. And so I think he overdoes the purgation, to be honest. But I understand why. First of all, he went through trauma and in telling the story. But you see, he tells the story too much. That's what he's doing in his book, commenting on the Dark Night. He keeps bringing back the purgation thing too much. Well, that's what trauma victims do. They know that telling the story is the way to healing, but there's a danger of getting stuck on a tape that keeps going. And
Yeah.
John, there's a lot of repetition in John's writing, especially around the trauma.
Um,
So all that comes through to me very strong when I read him. And and so, you know, it's not just of our returning to the 16th century and quoting John on the cross. That's not our solution. But it is take that wisdom that Frank was talking about, the wisdom that's there, and to retranslate it and reinterpret it for our moment in history. And this is where the four paths really help us to see the big picture that John wasn't able to identify with the sacred. That he what can I say? He culminates with joy. It's amazing. One of his last teachings is about how all this leads to joy. I wonder if I could find it here. I have it someplace that I can't find. I don't think, but it's a long way getting there. And along the way, he does point out that sometimes God gives us these flashes of light and luminosity in the midst of our darkness and all this. But I just think that and of course, he has these amazing poems like in the Canticles where he says, "My beloved is the mountains and the wooded valleys and so forth, and the silent music and the supper that brings people together." I mean, he has this amazing via positiva. Well, that's the point. All his poetry is via positiva, but his commentaries are all purgation. You see, because that's the theology he got.
yeah.
And you know, he's kind of big on sin. But that's one thing I liked about the passage I read you. He's talking about evil with a mini Bob. That he's been fighting evil, not just sin, but evil. And that's the battle. And that there's been a resolution in his imagination, at least. Yeah.
Valente is a question, which is, what's the best way we can resist evil at this time?
Uh-huh. Well, number one, don't deny it. Don't get out of denial. And know the difference between sin and evil. Know that evil is this powerful thing that's bigger than humans, that has a spirit dimension to it, that is smart. Evil is smart. It goes where the power is. It does not wear a sign on its back saying evil, I'm evil, kick me. It wears rings and PhDs and all kinds of diplomas. And you know, don't be naive. Don't be naive. Naivete is not a virtue. And find allies, including intelligent commentators who show the courage. For me, the first sign of spirit is courage in our time. And you must find people as allies, but also as mentors or teachers who themselves are showing courage, that they're taking risks, because risk taking is part of taking on evil. And then do the inner work to strengthen yourself. That's where the virtue comes in, the strength. And that means, for example, turning off the TV and turning off radio and turning off the social media. You can't swim in that stuff 24 hours a day. You've got to go out to the oasis. You've got to experience the joy of life, even as you're fighting for it. And so all those are ways, pardon me, by which we wrestle with evil today. And study is important. And John mentions that too. And I must say, I'm having read all of his work now, I'm really impressed by his knowledge of the Bible. It's just amazing. One thing that's interesting is that he quotes the Hebrew Bible far more than he does the New Testament. Now, John had Jewish blood himself, as did Teresa of Avila. So they knew the Hebrew Bible in a way that a lot of Christians did not. But he knows the stories there. He comes up with these obscure stories from Jonah and Esther and all these minor characters you might see in the Jewish scriptures. But if you count the number of people he quotes the Hebrew Bible more than 100% more than he quotes, more than twice, in other words, than he quotes the New Testament. Of course, the New Testament is much shorter, but he did a study. I was really struck by how he pulled out all these quotes, and he must have had a heck of a memory to remember so much of what he wrote. I remember in that day, he was traveling a lot because he was a vicar provincial, and he traveled for thousands of miles on a donkey. And he was a busy guy and an administrator. He wasn't, an academic sitting in a library 24 hours a day. He was on the road a lot, and he was a confessor to the nuns and so forth. And again, not only was Teresa, who was a very strong woman, one chronicler in Teresa's day said, Teresa is just like a man, except for one thing: she doesn't have a beard. That's what one of the journalists today who met her said about Teresa. I mean, she was one tough cookie. Well, she had to be. She took on the Inquisition, and she cleaned out all these women nunneries that were filled with women who couldn't find husbands. They weren't there to pray. They were there because they couldn't find a husband. And their families put them in there. Rich families put them in there as a last resort. And Teresa was kicking them out. Well, this did not endear Teresa to the upper classes because they didn't want their daughters back, they couldn't marry off, and so Teresa was in battle after battle after battle, and of course it's because of her that John got in all the trouble that he got into too. He was actually, when he met Teresa, he was ready to quit the Carmelites and become a hermit or a Carthusian, which is a eremitical order. He was that interested in contemplation, and he saw it was not happening in his order. They were too busy about busyness. But it was she who talked to him and said, well, why don't you stick around and reform the order instead of leaving it altogether? And so that was part of the dynamic.
We
And,
have two more
and
questions.
he was close to other strong women too, other abbesses. Yes.
So
Priors.
Marguerite Langley, you've been waiting.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm a student of yours, Matthew, in daily meditations, and I am in radical amazement about how you live without whining or complaining about what's been done with you. And I use the word radical amazement, which is your friend Rabbi Herschel's word. I love how you quote everybody who you use. It's so honoring. Can you tell me, you've used a couple of times now that sentence about we are being turned upside down, maybe to shake all the nonsense out of us. Where is that? I think that's a part of what's saving you. And if it's not, I'm making it up. But I hope it helps to save me.
Well, no, that's true. I mean, the mystics are very personal to me, and
Yeah.
so yeah, definitely, I need them to save me. Like I needed Buck Gostar's and the Lakota tradition and the sweat lodges and sun dances in that tradition to keep my soul together when I was going through some rough times. But that's from Hafiz, Hafiz, and you'll find it in my book, One River, Many Wells. I have where I bring together all the world religions and mystics, especially, and scriptural writings. And that one would be in the last chapter on the spiritual warrior. I take 18 themes, being creation and meditation and light and suffering and joy and life after death and compassion. But the last one, the second to last theme is compassion, but the very last one is spiritual warrior. Because I realize you can't be compassionate without that energy of the warrior, which is prophetic. That's a prophet too. It's, for me, warrior and prophet are synonyms. But it's in that chapter, and there's more that Hafiz says too. So I recommend going there and checking him out. He has a lot to say about the warrior. Here's another thing he says. He says the warrior takes every jewel in the, let's see, well, he talks about how we inherit negativity. He calls it something else. The hooves. He talks about the hooves. We have to trample the hooves of the animals that chase us, from the past, in order to protect every jewel in the heart. And then he also talks about the future, and he says the warrior is not afraid because he's not living in the future, he's living in the now. And fear is about the future. But, he puts it in poetic ways. But he has a lot to say, and I love that section in that part of the book. So it's in one of those, yeah. Mhm.
Let's take a question from.
And of course, I have the footnotes there, so you can go to the other books where you find them. Yeah. Go ahead,
Robert,
Robert.
you have to unmute. Robert, you have to unmute. Hello.
Hello, Dr. Fox. I want to ask you, is there any archetype of American civilization that you think is, you have to replace what's bad with something good. So is there any archetype of American civilization that you envision? I'm reminded of the Star Trek series for many decades that at the least they exemplify the furthest outreaches of social behavior, human social behavior, so that we get to see ourselves in a reflection. But do you think that, if not Star Trek, in the various series through this decade, there's some other archetype of American civilization that you recommend to replace the one we're currently experiencing?
That's very interesting. Well, I think there are a lot of high points in American history in terms of my generation, the life we've lived. The civil rights movement, I think, was astounding. It took so much courage. It took hundreds of thousands of people participating to fill the jails. And having lived in Oakland for 34 years, I met a lot of Black adults who were teenagers then in the South and went to jail as teenagers, and their stories. And I had the privilege of meeting one of the leaders of the Black Civil Rights Movement in Birmingham, Fred Shuttlesworth. And he was a friend of King, but unlike King, he was not educated. He didn't go to college or anything. He was a street minister, but he was the leader. And he's the one who convinced King to fill the jails with teenagers, because after a month in jail, the adults were going to lose their jobs. And you can't have that. So King didn't want to bring the teenagers in, but Fred said you have to. And Fred, the Ku Klux Klan beat Fred 3 times with chains, 3 different occasions. The sheriff locked up his children, one was 8 and one was 10, in jail. And the Ku Klux Klan blew up his home one day, and he was in it. But he walked out alive. And he invited me to come to Birmingham for a dialogue on ecology and racism, he and me. And it was held in the Civil Rights Museum. And I remember, it's across the street from that church where 6 girls were killed on a Sunday morning. And but before we did our public dialogue, we were having a little lunch, splitting a sandwich. And I said to him, I have one question for you, Fred. Where did you get your courage? And he said, you can call it courage, but I don't. I call it trust. He said, when I walked out of my house, the roof caved in, they'd blown up the whole thing. I was still alive. He said, I knew they couldn't kill me. They could kill my body someday, but not me. And they could not kill the movement. So that was a tremendous moment for me, to listen to a courageous man tell me where he got his courage. And it is about trust. And of course, trust, is a real meaning for faith. The word for faith in the New Testament does not mean a pile of doctrines. I'm sorry, it doesn't. It never has, and it never will. It means trust. Pistuin is a Greek word. And Jesus on numerous occasions said to people, go your way, your trust has healed you. we've translated that as faith. But that's where America is great. And it's at the grassroots. And another example of greatness, I think, is the Second World War. I mean, I'm not someone who thinks that Hitler would have gone away by not opposing him the way he had to be opposed. And I think of two uncles I had, one on my father's side who was a Marine and fought in Iwo Jima and Guadalcanal, some really tough battles there in the Pacific. And my other uncle by marriage is my mother's side, who fought in Europe, and he helped liberate Dachau. And he told me stories about what it was like walking in Dachau.
My battery's running low, and we may be,
Well,
jumped off the air. I so
okay,
apologize.
but
I don't
you're
wanna cut
asking
it
for
short.
stories, and those
I'm
are
so
stories.
sorry about
The millions of men and women in battle and at home in the Second World War. I think there was a story. There is a story there of generosity and justice, a fight for justice, and so I think that's part of our story too. And I think great people like Abraham Lincoln and of course the Sojourner Truth and all the black leaders, 19th and 20th century, and of course King and his martyrdom. I mean, there is so much beauty and greatness, I think, in the story of America, along with plenty of sin and imperfection and evil. But I think those are the stories we want to build on, and we have to do in our generation what they did then, and the imagination it took, the courage it took, the organizing it took to bring about the civil rights laws. This is something to really remember.
And
Thank you.
Michelle, you want to raise a question? This would have some time. I'm
Yes.
so sorry about
Yes,
that.
thank you, before your battery runs out. First of all, thank you, Matthew. This was an incredible evening. This insight and what you've brought with St. John of the Cross is just amazing. And thank you so much. And thank you for bringing your trust and your courage to the world. And you have. I've studied with you since the 80s, the late 80s, and it is, you're a beacon of light and inspiration for us. And thank you, thank you, thank you. My question is, I don't even know if you need to address this at all. And then thank your ancestors too, because when you're starting to talk about your uncle, that's very powerful. Could you just speak a little bit about Mechtilde of Medenberg and her spirituality, her mysticism in context of today?
Yeah, I want to. Thank you for that, because I just didn't have time. But she, of course, lived in the 13th century, so 200 years before John the Cross, and she named the dark night of the soul in her own way. And she was a Beguine. The Beguines were the women's movement of the Middle Ages. They were not nuns and they were not married. They created a third thing. There were no religious sisters or tertiary orders at that time in the 13th century. So the Beguines had a lot of trouble. The Pope condemned them 17 different times, which suggested it wasn't working very well as condemnation. But the men were up against them because they felt they were loose women, because they weren't locked up in marriage and they weren't locked up in nunneries. So what else could you think? But she has a Via Negativa poem that is very powerful. And she begins by saying, there comes a time when both body and soul enter into such a vast darkness that one loses light and consciousness and knows nothing more of God's intimacy. At such a time when the light in the lantern burns out, the beauty of the lantern can no longer be seen. With longing and distress, we are reminded of our nothingness. So that's how her poem begins. I mean, she's talking about the dark night of the soul, obviously, and talking about it in beautiful language. I shared this just a few weeks ago with Mirabai Starr. And of course, she's written about John the Cross, Mirabai Starr. And she, who's written a lot on women mystics, and she said that is so feminine a way of talking about the dark night. But here's how she ends her poem, and it goes like this: love the nothing, flee the self, stand alone, seek help from no one, let your being be quiet, be free from the bondage of all things, free those who are bound, give exhortation to the free, care for the sick, but dwell alone. When you drink the waters of sorrow, you shall kindle the fire of love with the match of perseverance. This is the way to dwell in the desert. It's a beautiful poem and a beautiful statement. And actually, when you notice that, there are a lot of the same images here as there are in John the Cross. The fire in the match, and again, caring for the sick and dwelling in the desert. So she's really a marvelous articulator of this same archetype of that of the dark night of the soul, dark night of society, dark night of our species. Mm-hmm. Thank you for asking that. I'm glad
Thank you.
to sneak Mechtild in. I wanted cues on my list, but didn't time.
Thank you. Thank you.
There seems to be a spiritual paradox of sorrow and compassion, suffering and compassion. I guess it's an archetype in itself, but I'm hearing that strain, that the mystery of both.
Definitely the wounded healer.
The wounded healer.
That those who have tasted the via negativa, tasted the suffering, are understanding in the via transformativa, in compassion of others who are undergoing that, you know. So yeah, as you say, that self is an archetype. Yeah, it's a lesson, you know, that our suffering, that's one reason for suffering, is to be able to understand the suffering of others. Because suffering is so deep, just like joy is, that if you haven't tasted it yourself, you know, how are you really going to understand it in others? You know, there's a great teaching, this is from Mechtild too, about how she says we're given two wines to drink in this life: the wine of joy and the wine of suffering. And until you've drunk deeply of both, you have not lived. And of course, she's German. Mechtild, Magdeburg is not that far from Berlin. So in Germany, the white wine is much better than the red wine. So I'm glad she's not French and said that. So she's saying, you know, that's what I said earlier about going to the oasis. You got to drink the white wine of life, the joys of life, and the suffering, the red wine, to be fully alive and fully present.
That's beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah.
That brings up a question or a comment about the raves that you have endorsed and supported. And I'd like to hear more about that, and this idea of, you know, experiencing the Holy Spirit through this physical involvement with music and movement and group.
Well, yes, when I was first silenced and then 3 years later expelled by the Pope, by the Inquisition of our time, regarding my life of the Dominicans in the church, I was writing a book called Reinvention of Work. And when it happened, actually. But the last chapter, I thought I was done, and then I had a dream that I should add a chapter on the reinvention of ritual. Because I think liturgy is very important. I think ritual and ceremony is very important. It keeps people together in the hardest of times. And so I did that, how to reinvent liturgy. And then I handed my manuscript in, and I went to Seattle, where there was a conference for a week on creative spirituality that I was helping to lead. And 6 people, young people in their 20s, flew in from Sheffield, England. And Sheffield, England was really the capital of rave at that time. And rave at that time in Sheffield did not mean drugs. But they told me this story how they were doing a lot of rave, that this whole community of 400 people putting it on every week. And they went to their local church, Anglican church, and said, we think what we're doing is real spiritual, religious. Can we bring it to the church here? And they said, the rector said, sure, bring it in. So they did. They kind of moved into the church and they had these rave masses, liturgies. And, but after 6 months, the rector came to them and said, and I quote, you have to leave now. And he said, why? And he said, because I'm getting complaints that there are too many young people in church. Unquote. I think that's the last time that sentence has been uttered in the West. And so they left and they found a public place downtown and had it there every Sunday. So make long story short, I flew to Sheffield to check it out and I was blown away by it. And including in it was in Mass that I was there for, there this fellow, he's about 12, he was so short, he got up and he had rapped my original blessing book, and I thought that was pretty amazing. But anyway, yeah, they were bringing together dance and the new media. There were a lot of TVs there because they were projecting live speakers and so forth on the television sets. And it was quite an event. And I asked them, how can I help you? And they said, well, we follow your theology. There's theology of the cause of Christ and all that. But if you're to become an Anglican or Episcopalian, you could run interference because you're a theologian and you're a priest and you get what we're doing and why we're doing it. So I thought about that and prayed about it and realized, well, the Pope had fired me. He doesn't need me anymore. So I went to the Episcopal bishop in California and said, here's the deal. I'm thinking of becoming Episcopalian in order for one thing only, to reinvent forms of liturgy, forms of worship, with the young people using rave. And this was a good bishop in San Francisco, Bishop Swing. And he said, go for it. We're not doing anything for young people. We should be, but we're not. And I said, well, I have a question for you. And it's this: will you protect me from your right wing? I said, I've been fighting the Vatican for 12 years, and I'm not going through this again in the name of religion. Will you protect me from your right wing? And he said, Matt, I'll tell you a story. I began my priesthood in West Virginia, where I'm from, and the issue was civil rights back then in the early 60s. He said, I took on the presidents of mining companies around civil rights. So I'm a street fighter. I may not read any of your books, but I will protect you from my right wing. And we shook hands, and I said, Bishop, we can do business together. So that's how my life as an Episcopalian began. And then I spent a year with the rave movement of San Francisco Bay Area, which was very strong. We met every week for a year to talk about the Mass because, I was acknowledging we were going to borrow some of their practices, such as DJ and VJ and rap and dance, but do it in liturgy. And they had 2 big questions. First, why call it a Mass? And secondly, what about drugs? And I said, there'll be no drugs. I will prove to you that you can get high on liturgy if the liturgy is interesting and involves the body and all the chakras. And as far as why we call it a Mass, I said, well, Leonard Bernstein is a Jew and he's written a Mass, and Bach is Lutheran and he's written a Mass. So no one owns the name Mass. It is the public word for liturgy in the West. You just got to live with it. And I said it's very political to call it a Mass because by doing it as a Mass, you're telling the Pope he doesn't know how to pray very well. Well, what happened was over the drug thing, we lost about 50% of the ravers, and that's fine. But 50% stayed, and we did it. And so now we put on about 125 of these Masses over 25 years. 3 at the previous 3 World Parliament of Religions, 1 in Salt Lake City, 1 in Toronto, 1 in Chicago. And they're powerful, powerful, powerful experiences. And I just know that this is the future of worship and liturgy, if we have a future. Because they bring together people of all generations and people of all religions. Not only Christians show up, but Buddhists, Muslims, atheists. One woman showed up as an atheist, but she left as a Well, she took communion at the end. She said that he had this tremendous awakening during the grieving part, because we grieve. We don't talk about our sins. Instead, we get down on the floor and we do a grieving practice. And that is so powerful for people. People have to be invited to grieve today in a physical way, because we carry grief in our bodies, in our molecules and atoms and cells. And the churches aren't doing that. Neither is the synagogue. And we must be able to grieve together. So amazing things have happened. And here's just one story. One time when we were doing it in Oakland, because we got our abandoned ballroom there, and we used that for this mass. It had a wooden floor, good for dancing. This woman came and she said she was a counselor of teenage kids on drugs. So she brought a van full of teenage kids on drugs, about 10 of them. She said on the way back, they said to her, "This is the first time in our lives we've gotten high without drugs." Well, that's exactly the point I made to the rave people at our first gathering for that first year, where all we did was talk about this, because I wanted to get the involvement of their community. So anyway, I have a lot of stories to tell, but we don't have time for that. But it's time that that we bring the postmodern art forms of DJ and VJ and rap and so on into worship. Think of the revolution of the 12th century, when the Gothic revolution opened up spaces in churches and all this light came in, and then you had the greatest stained glass ever created. And so you had this amazing thing happening because a new technology was developed. And so we're living in a parallel time. There's a new technology out there. Why aren't all the churches using it? And we're wondering why there are no young people in church, etc. I remember one teenager who was Latina and Catholic. She said to me, "Are you telling me that I can both dance and pray at the same time? Those are my favorite things to do. I can bring them together." I said, "Damn right. It's about time." And so engaging all the chakras is essential if we're going to be whole human beings. And that's what you do in a cosmic, we call it the cosmic mass. There's moments for engaging all the chakras, and the grieving and the celebrating. So we're still doing these, but not as often as I'd like. We have to get some funding for that. But we have a 30-something who's the director, and we're working to try to carry this on and pass it on.
Regrettably, I think I'm going to ask you for any closing statements that we may have missed. It's going on 2 hours, and I don't want to press you into.
Yeah, I think
I think everybody's
long enough. Yeah. Well, I just want to thank you for the invitation. Thank you, you folks, for staying and participating. And I want to offer my blessing that all of you will be the mystics and the prophets that you're called to be at this time in history, and that together, and the links that you have with your own various communities, whether at work or family or citizenship, all of it, that we can gather the energy and keep it flowing. And remember what Eckhart says: compassion begins with your own body, begins at home with your own body and your own soul. So in times like this, you don't want to burn out. You don't want to just be angry and all that. No, you want to, that's where virtue comes in. Get hold of yourself and ask what are the contributions you can make, and with whom, who are your allies, and how do you become a camel? Take care of yourself that way, and do the study and the rest, and find that the teachers who are showing courage and risk to speak out at this time. And what's going to save America is the grassroots. There's not a time for looking for heroes. No, it's a time for gathering with others who are feeling what you're feeling. And the point of my presentation today is to show you that this is, our ancestors went through things like this too, that this is what it means to organize. And take your anger, and it is a fire, honor it, but turn it into something positive. And the way
Creative arts.
is joyful.
Briefly, Matthew, the cosmic masses includes cosmology, doesn't it? Our connection to the cosmos.
Oh, absolutely. All authentic ritual is about connecting to the cosmos.
Mhm.
Yeah.
The human and the divine.
The human and the divine and all of creation.
Mhm.
And we want to acknowledge that whenever we pray.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, this has just been such a blessing, such a great message at a time that is a real crisis. And I think you've addressed it really well and, brought up the fact that other people in history have been in the dark crisis of
Mhm.
fascist rulership, and they are an inspiration to us.
Amen.
There's so much more to say, but thank you. We couldn't be happier. There are many, many lovely comments from people in the chat that are thanking you and telling you that it was just fabulous, and it really was. Keep it up, and you really are a light in the world, and we really appreciate the radiant wisdom.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good to be with you all.
Thank you,
Blessings.
Matthew.
Everybody,
Mhm.
yeah. Thank you for supporting the Jung Center. Thank you for supporting our little effort here to bring about a transformation through wisdom and through community.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Right
Matthew.
out.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bless
Young
everybody.
Center.
Excellent.
Thank you, Young
Excellent.
Center.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, really, really good. Just wonderful.